Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the video. So, sometime back I had released a little tack review of a small jrpg called Fairytale Episode 1. Now, for this game I had some, pretty high hopes. I mean, this was a French indie developer, like a one-man team. It screamed 90s era inspiration. I mean, after all, the devs themselves claimed this on the eShop bio, so I was super hyped to play this game, feeling that I wanted to travel back in time for that 90s nostalgia I enjoy. And alas, after playing that game, Episode 1 for its entirety, which only lasted for about an hour and a half, I walked away, well, let's just say a bit less than disappointed. So naturally, I made a video on it, dropped a tack review, which was probably the most scathing review I've ever done, at least up until this point. So, if I were to just go for it in a gist, it was presented extremely beautifully. Amazing set pieces, great backgrounds, graphics, catchy audio direction. Gameplay was serviceable, with a system that's familiar, but just overly burdened with extra actions and commands that contributed close to nothing for the game. Now, this was also in the absence of any tooltips or any form of information that told you what these moves actually do. However, it was the story. Oh dear lord, that story that really kind of triggered me. Let's just say it missed the mark. But I mean, feel free to check out my thoughts on that specific episode after this video. In any case though, I ended that video, popped it up on YouTube, and I did so with a request, however. So should the developer ever see it, I wanted the developer to know that the critique came from one 90s era JRPG lover to another 90s era JRPG lover, with the hopes that maybe something would change for future installments. Well, fun fact, the dev actually saw the video and responded to me. And honestly, it was an apology for a bad experience, along with some justification that things were continuing to improve in future episodes. Now, while I'm likely making it sound like that's a bad statement, kind of a meaningless comment, oh, things are getting better, I do genuinely respect when creators address the not so positive feedback, and then they address it directly. So, especially in such a polite form. So I endeavored to make sure that I would keep up with future releases and to continue to see how this concept evolves. Well, here we are. Episode 2 is available on the Switch, and naturally I wanted to follow up. So, for this review, just a few points before we consider. First of all, consider this an extension of the Episode 1 review, so I'm not going to spend loads of time breaking down the mechanics once again. If there's any major changes, I'll address them directly. Second, most of my focus for this is going to be on the story and my thoughts and experiences regarding it, so there will be lots of spoilers. Finally, I am fully cognizant that this was already released on Steam some time back, long before Episode 1 came out on the Switch, and changes may be minimal from what I pointed out in my initial review. So I'm not going to rehash points that there was no time to fix. Rather, I want to communicate my experience and thoughts in a meaningful way to the developer, again, from one classic JRPG fan to another. So with that said, let's jump in and talk about Fairytale Episode 2 and what this brings to the table. Starting with the gameplay, Episode 2 plays identically to Episode 1. It's your typical turn-based affair with an overabundance of commands, some of which you will never use. Additionally, there still aren't any tooltips or information guides that explain what some of these skills actually do. For instance, Haru's Protect skill still does what exactly? This lack of information available extends to all parts of the game, unfortunately. Stat information can be assumed, but you don't have any concrete information on what SK level does, maybe skill level does, and I have no idea what FR level even is. Furthermore, the completion tab still tracks all events, but it doesn't really provide any meaningful context on the how or the why. It would be cool if extra information would be supplied, like the old school bestiaries or lore tabs in past games, so maybe that's something that will come out in Episode 3 or later, not really too sure, but it would be cool if that was the case. As for what's new, of course, new orbs and items have been introduced, but in limited supply. Probably the best addition are the summon orbs, of which there are 2. These call back to the old school cutscene attacks from before Final Fantasy X. These are lovely, but suffer from various issues that I'll point out in subsequent sections. Also, new party members have been added, a healer type a la Aerith, and a thief type a la Yuffie, both with their own unique skills. However, only one can be paired with Haru at a time, so to switch you'll need to visit a save point and just swap your party members. Finally, battles are much more frequent than in episode 1, but still use that location system. I will admit though that the difficulty seems to have been scaled up in some early and late game fights, but this difficulty is just limited to damage outputs and HP bars. The AI is still extremely straightforward and can easily be countered with the right orb, in this case usually the fire orb. Also, on a side note, how is it that my limit break skill that the boss is weak to deals 0 damage whenever I use it? I don't know. Anyway, just to recap, the game functions identical to the first game with some new items to spice things up. Don't expect much in terms of new challenges though. Speaking about the presentation, neko.works has once again created a visually and auditory feast for your senses. Right from the title screen, you're met with a lovely soft track that screams Mel Bell from Clanad, with the distinct visuals of neko.works' illustrator, Romy. I hope that's how you pronounce that, sorry. When getting into the game itself, you're treated to the same beautifully rendered 2D backgrounds that flow smoothly into the 3D assets. To top that off with the fine detailed chibi character models, you get an absolutely charming visual experience. This time, multiple environments have also been added, including snowfields, small towns, forests, and more. To further set up the atmosphere, the OST comes back swinging with some excellent tracks to add mood and flair into these new areas. With that said, however, I do find that the sound effects and battle themes are quite repetitive. So, with many more battles added, the track does become quite overplayed. Additionally, the continued use of basic Japanese expressions at the end of battles or during very specific sections is jarring to say the least. Honestly, it would be best left out, as the Japanese used is really meaningless in the grand scheme, which fundamentally goes against how the language is used. Specific shout out to the Dark Summon for that one. Speaking of which, we need to talk about the performance this time around. Typically, the game plays super smoothly as it did in episode 1, however, at least on the Switch, the visual upgrades are starting to take a toll at times. Some of the more intense magic effects, ice more specifically, had caused a pretty large loss of fidelity. Some of the environments, such as the ice castle, had frame drop issues as well. Specifically when Haru was running down the halls, it got a bit janky. However, the biggest offenders are the summons and their associated cinematics. The second you summon one, the game will play an FMV and boy does it get blurry. If by chance this was a conscious choice to call back to the 90s kind of graphical fidelity, please undo it. The sharp graphics of the core game just contrast so poorly to the FMVs you made. Don't get me wrong, they are very cool, but they just look awful next to the actual in-game graphics. So, it's also important to note that it would be cool if each summon had their own, identity? I mean, they all look like anime maids, and especially the ice summon. I thought I'd be able to summon the monster I killed, i.e. the Ice Queen, that I got the summon from, not just a blue maid. To recap, at least for this part, episode 2 feels like a 1 step forward, 2 steps back situation. On one hand, the impressive visual direction makes for a cinematic experience that throws back to 90s JRPGs. On the other hand, there are clear issues with the performance and a bit too much audio repetition which mars the experience. In all, if you're willing to handle the back and forth with performance, you can get through it. Otherwise, just don't use the summons, I suppose? Okay, so here we go. During my episode 1 video, I really went into depth with various points, but my issues at that time can be broken down into maybe 3 key points. First, it was too short. Second, it's too unoriginal. Third, it missed the point of complex character actions with the environment, other people, and finally, the characters themselves. This time around, I would say some of my issues have been remedied. The overall episode itself clocks in at around 4 hours, which is nearly 2 to 3 times longer than episode 1. In terms of why, it's mostly been padded with longer dungeons and some new story beats, so that's a welcome change, more time with the world, more time with the characters. Now, that segues nicely into the unoriginality problem, which also feels like less of an issue this time. Most of the game is spent navigating various parts of a tundra, which is usually just a side story area for most JRPGs. The locals and zones are fairly straightforward. I mean, you have your shantytown, you have your ice castle, and then your foresty maze. But each holds a more unique industrial feel that seems to be emerging as the game's sort of identity in a way. Also, with that note, a few new characters have been introduced, and they have very clear inspirations from the FF7 source material. Ayaka is most definitely Aerith, and the mysterious girl actually seems like a reference to Elven Lied and Lucy. Unfortunately, these are only the two new characters introduced, and as we will soon discuss, missed the mark. When talking about the character interactions from Episode 1, my main issue was that the character actions from Episode 1 made no sense. For example, Haru jumping from the cliff at the end had no real significance. Kid disappearing, which apparently triggers Haru's desire to join the resistance, of which then nothing really comes to fruition of, feels rushed. I mean, the story was pieced together as a series of and then statements which could be recapped in a matter of seconds. So, how does Episode 2 roll? Not that much better, and in some cases, probably a little bit worse. Now, I'm going to give a quick heads up here. I'm going to get into spoilers now, so be ready. If you're interested in knowing the plot, you can continue with this analysis. Otherwise, you probably just want to jump ahead to the last section. So, the plot starts directly after the cliff plummet from Episode 1. Naturally, as you are the main character, you survive, and you want to make it back to Kuroko. You know, that girlfriend-ish character from the first game? After a short trek, you meet Ayaka, and you learn about the village, which is just another shantytown slum where people who get the boot from the city go. Honestly, so far so good. However, once you arrive and Kid gets reintroduced, the story starts getting unfocused. Basically, you're asked to do a side quest to keep the heaters on in a snow valley. This is dealing with a kind of a... how do you describe it? I would say a temperature minigame that if your body temperature goes too low, you basically get knocked out and you gotta be respawned somewhere else. Anyway, upon completion of this task, the Empire comes and takes a bunch of people in this shantytown that you visit, of which Kid is one of them. You are then implied, pretty clearly, to go after him, Kid, by chasing Kid into the forest, where the Empire took him. However, at this pretty much exact same moment, you're given the Fire Orb, which allows you to not have to deal with that temperature minigame mechanic that I just mentioned a few seconds ago. This has been the case in previous areas through the tundra, again with that side quest for the heaters. Now, I remembered when I was kind of going through those little areas before the shantytown that there was an area that was basically inaccessible, and that would lead to something called the Ice Queen, some kind of Ice Queen monster. And a lot of NPCs mentioned about that there was an Ice Queen and she's very powerful and she's causing the storm. So I'm thinking, this sounds like a pretty good time to backtrack and get some side dungeons before I punch forward with that story and rescue Kid, right? All right. So I head back, I do this fairly long castle dungeon, beat the Ice Queen, get her summon, and the Dark Summon as well for some reason. Feeling satisfied now with banging out some of these side quests, I come back to the shanty town to find Kid. He's all right. He's back, and he wants to join the party and fight with me. Wait, what? Okay, turns out I thought that this side quest, this castle town, this was actually the main quest. I mistook it for a side quest. I skipped over some potential event that would have had me go to the ice castle anyway. So, score, I guess, but now I'm lost wondering why a small, what seemed to be side quest with an old man and his granddaughter and an Ice Queen monster had to do with rescuing Kid and impacting this Empire's raid of the shantytown. Anyway, for whatever reason now, it's time to move forward and go into that said forest anyway. After all, the main reason why we're heading in there is to meet back up with Kuroko, remember from episode 1, that girlfriend character that we need to meet. So, I go in, navigate the usual mysterious forest maze, KO a robo-boss, and find a small ruin that, for some reason, Haru feels is too dangerous for anyone but himself to go through. So he ditches his companion, whoever it might be, and enters alone. Upon entering, the bodies of Empire soldiers litter the ground. A woman in red appears, mocks Haru, threatens to kill him, and then Haru grabs her hand, says, "We gotta go," and runs off camera and... What? So, once again, a lot of happenstance with no legitimate context. I will explain this moment in just a moment, but story-wise, this really makes no sense. I'm flabbergasted here. The whole objective from the start is to get home to Kuroko. Everything that we do is done, presumably, to get home. There's no discussion or talk of joining the resistance that came up in episode 1. There's no mention of the woman in red, and how Haru might know her. It honestly feels like I missed like 2 or 3 sub-chapters of before this point. And then, on that note, why does Haru randomly think it's too dangerous for his companion to enter the ruins with him? Especially after all the battles they fought together, which includes Empire robots and a freaking Ice Queen monster. There's no mention of this woman in red, aside from the opening videos and the box art, which, yeah, that's not really playing into the direct story. So why is he like, take my hand and let's go? And then why is entering the ice castle required to save Kid? What did I miss by not entering the forest first? There's just so many questions I have that stem from a place of total confusion. And again, I feel missed that mark of what 90s JRPGs were about. That is, clear, nuanced events that lead in service to the plot, showing character development in the process. So, this time around, I'm going to take a different approach. I'm going to try to convey how I think the story could be reshaped to fit the nuances of that 90s JRPG concept that they were known for, while maintaining all the concepts that Light Fairytale introduces intact in the story. Now, for this, we're going to reset the clock back to when we first met Ayaka. Now, Ayaka, honestly speaking, is introduced very well in my opinion. She's a hermit living in an abandoned village. She's considered a ghost by the shantytown people which live across the way from her, and she has this strange healing powers. Furthermore, she appears older to Haru when they first meet. Unfortunately, by the time you reach the shantytown, which is about maybe 10 minutes later, nothing more is said of her powers. She's not actually a ghost, and she only looks older because she wears a cowl, of which she then stops wearing to keep her young appearance. So perhaps this could have been a more nuanced character to set everything else up in the game. For instance, rather than playing off the older image meme trope of her looking like she's like an aunt or an obachan, maybe keeping her appearance older could function as a foreshadowing of something greater, especially with those mysterious healing powers she has, which honestly should have been showcased just a little bit more for me. This would have also twisted the trope of the flower girl, making things just a little bit more interesting. This also would have allowed her to be better set up for the next concept that's introduced, which is the Ice Queen. Now, I neglected to mention this before, but it is mentioned in-game that the Ice Queen is essentially a human child that was turned into a monster by some form or some kind of magic. I think fairy magic, more specifically, which is honestly, I feel, a really cool concept that I want to know more about. So, tying Ayaka into that could potentially be used to help set up that as a parameter, especially after meeting Kid and the actual Ice Queen. On that note, let's talk about Kid because I've brought him up enough times and you probably have no idea who he is. If you recall, Kid was an NPC from episode 1 that about halfway through got picked up by the baddies and deported to the Icelands. This was supposed to be the impetus for Haru wanting to stick it to the Empire. All of this dropped in episode 2, and honestly, Kid doesn't really contribute anything to the story, aside from just being an alternative party member. So, for this change, why not make Kid a bit more integral into that concept of the Ice Queen? Maybe the Empire was going to use fairy magic to turn Kid into one of these fairy monsters. Maybe the Ice Queen ambushed the Empire to get Kid because she wanted him to be the next Ice King or Queen. I'm actually not too sure about Kid's gender. This could also make the ice castle feel more important for the party as a main story quest rather than the side quest feeling it has now. Also, about the Ice Queen herself, she can make references to the fairy that caused this to happen to her, which could be a good way to foreshadow the mysterious girl. This also better sets up Haru to understand and to have feelings about these fairy magics that seem to be extremely dangerous to people who are involved with it. This could then accumulate at the end when we meet the mysterious girl. Now, real quick, after you beat the game, you could play a short, and I mean short, side story as the mysterious girl. It's during this you kind of get the information that she could be or is a fairy. Now, I don't know what that means, but she definitely has a lot of power and a very bad attitude that you do not want to get in the way of. So, coming back to the story, the same setup can be given, though this time the dead Empire soldiers should come a bit earlier. This will give Haru that feeling that perhaps it's best for him to go alone. He goes on ahead, comes face to face with the mysterious girl, and then they do more of maybe like a mock or scripted battle that Haru fights her and then somehow maybe better understands who the mysterious girl is, why she's the way she is, and maybe get a way to kind of understand and deal with her mental damage. Then that makes a bit more sense by having him offer his hand to her as a way to escape the suffering that she's going through, or it could be a way for her to get revenge. Again, it can really go many different ways, because unfortunately, Haru doesn't really contribute anything himself during the whole episode 2. All he wants to do is just get back to Kuroko. He doesn't really want vengeance, he doesn't really want to help people, he just wants to get back to his childhood friend. So, yeah, I wish there was a bit more of that as well. I don't know, maybe I'm just being a bit too tropey, or maybe that's an unoriginal idea, but ultimately for me, the story let me down this time as well. Even though that all the pieces were in place for something very unique and interesting, I just didn't feel it connected together in the way that really gives that nuanced feel. Even though that episode 1 had a lot of issues, I wanted to see what the developer continued with. And episode 2 did very well in subverting my expectations at first. Ultimately, however, it seems that the vision was lost about midway through. Despite a more original world building system and very beautiful nostalgic directions, the story still has a very hard time standing on its own. Now, I know up to this point there is an episode 3 or maybe even episode 4 out on PC, Steam now, so I do hope that these can be made available for the Switch sooner than later, as I am very interested to see how much the developer continues to build this narrative and see how it better structures over time. Anyway, thank you for checking out this video. Oh, thank you. Whoop. Yeah, thank you for checking out this video. I'm going to keep that in there. This may not be too well known, or honestly probably not really well viewed. However, if this title does seem interesting and you're willing to drop a few bucks for a quick 90s nostalgia trip, it might be worth your buy. In the meantime, let me know in the comments your favorite JRPGs, and yeah, let me know your experiences with this game if you've taken the time to actually check out episode 1 or 2. Also, if you enjoyed the content, a like, a sub, and a comment really goes a long way to helping support the channel, so thank you, as always, for sending your love. As always, this is Sho, and I will catch you next time in the next video. Cheers!